problem, and so they missed what is today obvious to us. It is not necessarily the intrinsic value of the coin that is important to setting prices. It is rather the number of coins in circulation. Now, the Romans weren't complete dummies. They understood the basics of scarcity and abundance. After all, they lived and died each year with crop failures and bumper harvests driving the prices of grain all over the map. But they never made the leap to understanding that the same laws affect currency. To the Romans, currency was a stable element. A coin was worth exactly what it was worth, whether there were 500 in circulation or 5 million. And the thing is, for the most part, that had been true in their experience. The price of goods and the wages of workers and soldiers changed very little over the centuries, in sharp contrast to our own experience of that trip to the movie costing more with each passing year. So they just failed to grasp that the sheer tonnage of coins out in the marketplace was affecting the purchasing power of all those coins. And here was Diocletian issuing even more coins. Better coins, yes, but still, more. And this is where the emperor and his advisors made their biggest mistake. They did not call back in nearly enough of the old coins. They cycled some out of circulation, but if he really wanted the currency put back on sound footing, Diocletian needed to put the recall of all the bad coins at the center of his policy, and he just did not do it. As a result, his new 5-coin system, while definitely introducing an element of stability, failed to do what the emperor wanted it to do. And unfortunately, he did not recognize that he had made this mistake. So when inflation continued, even after he launched his good coin policy, he looked elsewhere for the causes, and as we'll see, he wound up far afield, blaming people, places, and things that had nothing at all to do with the real underlying issue. As he waited patiently for the currency to revalue itself, and then watched helplessly as it did not hire to pay for, and he understood instinctively that he couldn't afford to rely on the cash anymore. Taxes paid in cash were worthless. Wages paid in cash were worthless. If Diocletian was going to keep the empire functioning, and just to be clear, when I'm talking about the empire, what I really mean is the army, for the time being, taxes and wages were going to have to be assessed and paid by some standard other than money, something real and tangible, or at least something that seemed real and tangible. For this, Diocletian and his advisors concocted an elaborate and really ingenious new system to calculate imperial revenue and imperial expenses that cut out the middleman of cash, and was based instead directly on the goods and services that money was supposed to be able to purchase. The origins of Diocletian's new system of taxation lay in the way the army had come to rely on forced requisition to supply itself during the latter part of the crisis years. When times had been good and the money was sound, everything was done on the up and up, with the army purchasing goods and services from contractors more than willing to do business with the legions. When times got tougher, the goods and services were still purchased by the army, but from far less willing sellers, and commanders often invoked a proto-version of today's eminent domain laws, whereby in an emergency, the sale of goods and services were compellable by law. When times got really tough, and the money had become a joke, commanders no longer even bothered with the farce of compulsive transactions, and simply took what they needed. This new means of supplying themselves naturally changed the way that officers and soldiers were paid, as money had simply stopped being a functional medium of exchange. Officers and soldiers were now paid in kind, that is, with the goods themselves, rather than the money to purchase the goods. Grain, shirts, meat, blankets, shoes, whatever was around that approximated what a man would have purchased had his money been worth anything. It used to be that all of these items would have been deducted from a soldier's pay by the quartermaster. Now, they were the pay. This was the army that Diocletian had spent the majority of his career in, and though it is clear he was no fan of forced requisition because of the damage it did to the bonds of civil society, he understood that it was necessary. When he became emperor, then, his ideas about how to extract resources from his subjects and how to pass them along to his soldiers was informed by his experience with this ad hoc system of requisition and in-kind payment. But it shouldn't surprise you to learn that the thing that bugged Diocletian the most about the system was how random, arbitrary, and untidy it all was. So he set about to make the empire's new tax structure less all those things. In order to run a proper army, there were certain things a general learned by heart. If he had 1,000 men to feed, clothe, and shelter, he knew exactly how much timber he was going to need, how much wine he was going to need, how many horses he was going to need, and how many boots he was going to need. The army, in fact, had this practically down to a science. They knew down to the fraction of everything how much one soldier was going to add to their supply burden. Diocletian simply took this understanding and blew it up to an empire-wide level. Since the money was no longer any good, Diocletian just added up everything the imperial government required to outfit its army and bureaucracy for 1 year, which is the very first annual budget in the Western world, by the way, and then ordered his subjects to supply him with what he needed. But of course, the regions of the empire did not produce goods and services on a uniform basis. One city may specialize in textile production with nary a pig farmer in sight, while another may have abundant wheat fields but no brickworks. So you couldn't just divide up the list and demand everyone pony up the same fractions of everything. What Diocletian needed was a way of reducing what a man legally owed in taxes to some standard unit of measurement and exchange. Kind of like money, except we can't use money because the money is no good. So the answer was a new theoretical unit of exchange. Basically what the emperor and his advisors did was take everything listed in the new annual budget and make a giant equivalency chart to track the relative value of all the items. So many bushels of wheat equals so many shirts equals so many miles of transportation provided equals so many chickens, and so on. Then they reduced the total of everything down to manageable fractions and used that as the basis for taxation. So Farmer Gaius, who doesn't owe cash really anymore, also doesn't owe half a shoe and 2/3 of a shirt and a quarter of a blanket. Instead, he owes 5 units of tax, payable in whatever good or service he can most easily provide. In this case, probably bushels of wheat. Mule driver Publius, on the other hand, pays his 5 units of tax by transporting some swords the army needs from point A to point B. There is an inherent danger, of course, in that, well, what if everyone satisfies their allotment of tax by paying in pigs? But apparently it never came up, and the diversification of the empire's economy produced, mostly of its own accord, the supplies Diocletian demanded. The other question, then, was how do you assess how much a person is required to supply? For this, Diocletian turned to his newly enlarged bureaucracy. They fanned out across the empire and cataloged everything. They counted every man, woman, child, and slave. They counted how many chickens you had, and how many horses you had, and how many acres you owned, and what was being grown on them. They noted your profession, your skills, your physical strength, and they drew it all up on a ledger. Then, they asked around to see if you were hiding anything. Once everything was cataloged, the empire was reduced to 2 basic units: manpower and land, which is how imperial agents determined what your share of the tax burden was going to be. Both units were calculated with some nuance, with women and children being counted for less in the manpower department, because Diocletian was actually sensitive to matters of fairness. As I said, one of the problems he had with forced requisition was that it was arbitrary and cruel. So Diocletian really was trying to put in place a system that would take a man's particular circumstances into account, rather than just laying some blanket levy on his head, whether his 10 acres were prize vineyards or a rocky mountainside. So this is how it worked then, and I'll just make some numbers up here. Let's say your city has 500 units of land and 200 units of manpower. Well, according to our calculations, you collectively owe 75 units of tax. You can pay with whatever you've got. Shirts, bricks, timber, pigs. Just make sure that we get it. Payable in 3 yearly installments to account for spoilage. Thank you, and see you next year. Diocletian's solution was an ingenious way to get around the inflation issue, and in no time, the empire was reaping tax harvests like the good old days. Well, more even than the good old days. Back in its various golden ages, Rome had actually been pretty loose about taxes. As long as enough was coming in, they never really questioned whether there was more to be had, or whether they could be exploiting their empire more efficiently. But after systematically cataloging every single thing in the empire, and then applying a uniform system of collection, Diocletian was able to extract resources from his subjects at a previously unimagined level. He didn't take everything, of course, that would have been counterproductive. Diocletian kept to Tiberius's old maxim that the sheep must be shorn and not skinned, but he now had a far more exact idea of how close he could get without skinning the sheep. Unfortunately, his successors would not be so exact, a problem that we will get to in future episodes. But in his attempt to mobilize the resources of the empire as quickly and efficiently as possible, Diocletian did not stop with tax policy. He also inserted the imperial government directly into the economy in ways that had never been seen before. As I mentioned last week, Diocletian wanted the empire to function as one unified mechanism to maximize its power. But that did not mean just paying attention to the big stuff. It also meant ensuring that all the little screws and cogs and springs were where they needed to be, doing what they needed to do. In other words, the free market is about to become a lot less free. The rigid tentacles of the state first worked their way into the economy by way of the trade guilds, and from there extended themselves until they touched every man, woman, and child in the empire. Diocletian was not insensible to the danger that his new tax system would fall apart if everyone paid in pigs, and he was well aware that the chaos of the previous decades had caused massive population upheavals and severe shifts in the economic output of whole swaths of the empire. In other words, if he wasn't careful, the diversified economy Diocletian needed to make his new tax system work would collapse down into a few subsistence industries, with everything else being abandoned as an unsustainable luxury. Worse yet, many of the jobs that needed doing were not at all happy fun jobs. What if young Publius, son of Publius the mule driver, decides that he doesn't want to follow in his father's footsteps? What if all the sons of all the mule drivers decide that? Pretty soon, there will be no mule drivers left. It is entirely likely that had he not gotten into it, everything would have worked out fine, but Diocletian was never one to not get into something. As I just said, it started with the trade guilds. One of the first to be enveloped was the Guild of Shippers, who brought the grain from Africa to Italy. After doing business with the empire for centuries as an independent corporation, Diocletian simply took it over and declared the guild an arm of the government, and then took over wages and prices. Then it said that if you wanted to ship anything into Italy, you had to join the government's guild. And oh yeah, once you've joined, you can't resign. He followed that same pattern with everyone: brickmakers, cobblers, architects,